My name's Monica Bohm-Duch, and as some of you will know, I'm the initiator and the director of the Insiders Outsiders Festival that actually existed as a real-life, live, nationwide year-long arts festival from March 2019 to March 2020, when it was rather sort of rudely curtailed, but thank goodness, just as it was coming to an end anyway, by the dreaded virus. But a happy sort of and unexpected kind of bonus has been that kind of necessity of going online. And as some of you may know, this event today forms part of what's been an unexpectedly and really wonderfully rich series of online events dedicated to topics, broadly related to the theme of Insiders Outsiders, which is, of course, the hugely rich and diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. And of course, George Mayer-Marton fits the bill perfectly. So without further ado, I will just introduce the main compere, if you like, for this evening's event, Nick Braithwaite, who will in turn introduce the other speakers and kind of orchestrate the event from now on. Nick, as again, I suspect many of you already know, is the great-nephew of the artist under scrutiny today, and of course the event marks the publication of a wonderful little book. I will hold it up, some of you may already have seen it, much recommended, small and beautifully formed, dedicated to oh, I'm sorry, I'm going croaky, to George Mayer-Marton, and in particular focusing on his work for the Catholic Church in this country, occasioned by the need to raise the profile of a mural, a wonderful wall painting and mosaic that's currently under dire threat of destruction, demolition, and Nick, of course, will tell you more about that. But he's been very much at the forefront, he's been spearheading the campaign to save this remarkable work in Oldham, in the north of England. And he's reminded me that it's actually 4.5 years that the campaign has been underway, and he's refusing to give up. So well done, Nick. So I think without further ado, Nick, over to you to take over. All right, all the best.
Thank you very much, Monica. Let me just clear up my presentation.
Perhaps while Nick's doing that, if I could just add again, I'm sure you all know the way to do things these days. If you'd like to type in any questions and comments you may have into the chat function, I will read them out at the end.
Bear with me. Okay, are we there?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Monica, and thank you to everybody for attending this evening and for your interest in George Mayer-Marton and his murals, and a special thank you also to everyone who's been supporting the campaign for the Oldham mural. Most of the information in this talk is gleaned from conversations I had with my late mother, who was George's niece. I once asked her whether George, who seemed such a secure personality in many ways, had any faults. She thought for a minute and said, well, he never passed his driving test. Mayer-Marton's successful career as an artist in Vienna was cut short by Nazi persecution. He fled to England in May 1938, 2 months after the Anschluss, and he was able to move all his artwork to date from Vienna to London. 2.5 years later, almost all his paintings and most of his personal possessions were destroyed in the Blitz during the first big air raid of the war. So both his career as an artist in Vienna and most of his life's work to that point were destroyed. It's an interesting question, and one I'm not sure I have the answer to, how he managed to cope not only with, but overcome these tribulations. Perhaps a small part of it lies in his motto, don't itch where you can't scratch. The impetus for this group of talks is twofold. The immediate springboard is the forthcoming publication on 28th of March of Baquis Press's little book, conceived and edited by Robert Waterhouse, about George Mayer-Marton's mosaics and murals, the first book about George Mayer-Marton, but the wider context is the campaign, backed by SAVE and the 20th Century Society, to save the unique mural of the Crucifixion in the former Catholic Church of the Holy Rosary in Oldham, which Professor Clare A.P.Willsdon will talk about in more detail later, along with another mural work. Gordon Millar, a former pupil and assistant of George's, will talk about the Pentecost Mosaic, reflect on his mosaic technique, and offer some personal recollections of the man. I must issue a disclaimer at the outset that I'm not an art historian, a fact which will, I suspect, in any event become blindingly obvious. Although Mayer-Marton was my great uncle, I never actually met him. He died when I was 11 months old, but his legacy required attention in recent years, following the great efforts of my grandmother and mother in turn. Perhaps more significantly, I found his character and personality as relayed to me and my sister by my mother and grandmother both fascinating and inspiring, despite, or perhaps because of, the traumatic events which he surmounted. George Mayer-Marton was born George Mayer, Jury to his friends, in Győr in Western Hungary in 1897. That's the town, I think, which is depicted there, not far from the border with Austria, the second of 4 children to a professional and assimilated Hungarian-Jewish family. I fancy that even in this picture, there's a certain kind of determination that you can discern, but perhaps I'm deluding myself. So George is second from the right there, elder brother Pishter on the right, my grandmother Clary next to him, and Vilmos, the youngest, on the left. Pishter was killed in action in World War I on the Eastern Front, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian army. It appears George came bottom in his art class at grammar school, the first and least of numerous setbacks in his life. He served for 2 years from 1916 as an artillery officer on the Eastern Front and in Italy. That's a picture, a silhouette of himself that he sent home to his family. His war diary is held in the War Archive in Vienna. Excerpts from it can be found in Robert Waterhouse's book about Hungarian refugee artists, Their Safe Haven, which gives some idea of the traumatic scenes that he witnessed. This is a picture that I discovered quite recently, and it looks like the first public work that he sold. It's in the Massachusetts Institute of Art. Following his return from the war, George studied art in Vienna and then in Munich under Professor Max Dörner, whose mantra, "Craftsmanship must again be made the solid foundation of art," was to have a lasting impact on his development as an artist. This is a very early watercolor of the Hungarian landscape. By 1923 and settled in Vienna, he was married to Greta Fried, and we believe that is Greta. Greta was a talented pianist. She was, by all accounts, not the easiest person. When they had friends around for dinner, apparently George used to say, "I apologize in advance should my wife inadvertently fail to offend anyone." This is an early self-portrait in watercolor. During the 20s, calling himself Mayer-Marton rather than Mayer, which presumably signals his Hungarian identity in parallel with his Jewish background, he forged an artistic career as a leading light in the artist society in Vienna, the Hagenbund, first as secretary and eventually its vice president. What was the Hagenbund? Between the wars, it was the leading progressive artist society, as opposed to the more conservative Künstlerhaus. Since, from the early 20th century, it met in the Café Hagen, owned by the eponymous Herr Hagen. And you can see Herr Hagen on the left holding a statue. George is on the right there wearing knickerbockers. That's the jury of the Hagenbund, presumably trying to decide who to award something to. The Belvedere Gallery in Vienna, the National Gallery, mounted a major exhibition in 2014 about the Hagenbund, which used network analysis based upon extensive research to demonstrate the links between the Hagenbund and other modernist groups around Europe at the time. Mayer-Marton was shown to be at the very center of developing these connections, especially in the 1930s, and organizing joint exhibitions. This is a poster he designed for the for a festival in 1929 with theatre director Max Reinhardt. He traveled extensively in southern and central Europe between 1925 and 1938 and produced a large output of graphics, watercolors, and oils. He studied the art of faceted mosaic, about which more from Gordon shortly, in Ravenna in the early 1930s, where much Byzantine mosaic still survives. He also produced some fresco murals in Salzburg, the fate of which is as yet unclear, but which may well have been destroyed by the Nazis. That's in Dalmatia, and I think the next one is as well, although I can't actually identify the next one. In 1929, he did the illustrations for a Phaidon book, Der Kreidekreis, The Chalk Circle, by Clarbund, which became a bestseller in the German-speaking world. He studied Chinese painting for this work, which was based on a 14th century Chinese text. That's one of the illustrations from the Kreidekreis. For the first and last time in his life, he made some money, which he spent on a fine violin. He was a keen amateur musician, which is reflected in many of his artworks at the time. I think this one shows the Chinese influence, which is appearing in his etchings at the time. He even competed for Austria in the 1928 Amsterdam Olympics, which there was at that time an art competition, and he was disqualified for reasons which remain unclear, maybe because he was Hungarian and not Austrian. He was twice awarded the Prize of Honor of the City of Vienna, and that press article is about one of those occasions. The political situation in Austria was, of course, deteriorating during the 1930s, as well as the economic situation, much as in Germany. And following the Anschluss in March 1938, George saw the writing on the wall. Using contacts he'd built in an earlier Hagenbund exhibition in London, and with characteristic clear-sightedness and organization, he applied for a visa to live and work in England as a picture restorer, arriving in May 1938 with his wife Greta, having extracted all his paintings and possessions from Vienna. In this picture, they're stopping off in Brussels. During this period, starting with the flight from Vienna, he kept an exile diary, written in, I gather, very opaque German. This has now been partially and heroically translated by Susan Perkins and appears in their Safe Haven, which I mentioned just now. In the diary, he's critical of the UK's complacency towards Hitler. They do not realize they are dealing with the devil himself, he says, dismayed by the drabness and artistic parochiality of London in those days. He faces the situation with grim determination, but there is little sense of relief or escape. 9 months later, in February 1939, he received this letter from the Nazi authorities, who had disbanded the Hagenbund and destroyed its archive, describing it as degenerate and verjudet, which means, I suppose, full of Jews, but I think it has a sort of rather unpleasant additional connotation on top of that. My investigation into your personal circumstances shows that you do not possess the necessary commitment and reliability to promote German culture with responsibility towards the people and the Reich. Blah, 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 blah. As from now, any further professional activity as a painter and graphic artist is forbidden to you. Failing to find any work as a picture restorer, he obtained a job teaching art at the St. John's Wood School of Art, where he and Greta were able to rent a studio in the garden and store his artworks. The next 2 years or so, he and Greta managed okay until the September 1940 air raid during the Blitz. It was the first big air raid of the war. George took his 2 violins and a suitcase containing a number of watercolors and graphics into the air raid shelter in St. John's Wood. When he returned the following morning, the studio contained his remaining artworks and all the oils which he'd extracted from Vienna, as well as most of his personal possessions, had been reduced to ash. My grandmother Clary found him sorting through the rubble with tears streaming down his face. Practically his life's work had been destroyed. So this page is from the workbook, which he reconstructed after the fire. At the bottom there, he writes in German, "On the night of 11th to 12th September 1940, a German incendiary bomb set fire to the studio in 9 Elm Tree Road, which in the space of an hour burnt to the ground. A break in work, no materials, no tools. This workbook is reconstructed from the half-burnt original and is not comprehensive. However, the reconstructed workbook is, typically of George, meticulous. He'd always systematically photographed his oil paintings in black and white, of course, and by some good fortune, many of these photographs were not burnt, giving an invaluable record of his earlier work. They're now held in the Belvedere Archive in Vienna. These photographs probably helped him reconstruct his workbook. Greta suffered a mental breakdown as an immediate result of this disaster, from which he never recovered. George found work as a peripatetic lecturer for CIMA, the predecessor of the Arts Council, and traveled all over the country giving lectures on art and art history, while renting a room in Belsize Park and continuing all the while on his travels to paint. There he is giving some kind of tour or lecture, but I don't know where that is. I think it's pretty clear he was depressed during this period, and some of his watercolors show this quite clearly, especially the Welsh ones. In 1945, he learned that his parents, my great-grandparents, had perished in the Holocaust, having survived in Dürr until the end of the war, and that his younger brother Vilmos had died on a forced labor march. This watercolor appears to reference Jewish mourning ritual. It's in the Imperial War Museum. George painted extensively in watercolor during this period from 1938 to 1946, not least because he couldn't afford oil paints. I think one can see in his watercolors of the period that his initial depression is gradually lifting, and he's accustoming himself to the challenges of the subtle light of the UK landscape, which at first he'd found so drab. By 1946, he'd begun to paint in oil again, producing some memorable and distinctive evocations of the Welsh landscape in particular, while continuing to paint extensively in watercolor. This one's in the Vivian Gallery. This picture, The Turn in the Road, is one of my favorites of his, and it symbolizes for me his willingness to put the past behind him and to embrace the future. Around 1950, he started reconstructing oil paintings which had been lost in the Blitz, presumably not just to resurrect them, but also to process his loss. It's my surmise. This series continued for a number of years. This picture gives us a sense of the destroyed pictures. This is another reconstructed picture, remembering Lucin, which is now Luisin, I think, in Dalmatia, Croatia. And to me, it seems the haze of memory hangs over this oil painting. He took this one on holiday. He made this one on holiday in Brittany. And this one, I think, and this one. To me, this self-portrait conveys the sense that George is now again firmly in command of himself and ready to take on the world, despite the suffering that's etched into his face. In 1951, he was made redundant by CIMA, and Greta died in hospital in 1952. George decided to take up the post of lecturer, later senior lecturer at Liverpool College of Art. Sister Anthony Wilson, a former pupil at the college, described to me being appalled to see him on his first day there as a man apparently weighed down, almost crushed by his sufferings. However, Liverpool enabled him to flourish within a short time. He was well-liked and respected teacher, founding a school of mural art there. He was able to play chamber music with colleagues at the college. Many of his oils from this period have a musical theme. in an increasingly abstract and/or cubist style. From 1955 onwards, he received a number of mural commissions, mainly from the Catholic Church in the Northwest, which will be the subject of Gordon and Clare's talks shortly. This is his first commission, a font in Tetton Hall Church in Wolverhampton. I think what I like about this is the sort of playful quality of the font. You can see the sort of crocodile or something like it. Julian Treuherz, who I think may be viewing tonight, former keeper of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, has described these murals as Mayer-Marton's most powerful and ambitious works. The work in Oldham, the one in the middle, is unique in this country and perhaps, in my non-expert opinion, his masterpiece. It's been described as a dazzling work by Tristram Hunt, director of the V&A. This is Gordon's oil painting of the mosaic makers. You can just see a figure of Christ, I believe, but I don't know whether it's an imaginary mural or some real mural that this refers to. It seems to have echoes of Sutherland's tapestry in Coventry Cathedral. This painting is called March of the Parents from 1958, which was painted in the wake of the Hungarian uprising, but perhaps is also imbued with the loss of his own family and of the Holocaust. This is one of his most abstract works, Breton Fish Market. This painting, Dawn Park, was apparently painted contrary to his normal practice in a very short space of time. He went for a walk in the park very early one morning and rushed this out onto canvas. In early 1960, he was at the tender age of 63 able to buy his first house, where he lived with his girlfriend, Wendy Moran. 6 months later, George was suddenly taken ill with leukemia and within 2 weeks had died, writing poetry and making mosaic designs in his hospital bed to the very end. Some of the poetry is reproduced in their safe haven. In the mid-1980s, the church housing his Pentecost Mosaic in Netherton was faced with demolition. My mother sprang into action, gathering a team of experts, including Gordon Millar and Robin Riley, and managed to get it transferred to a new home in the Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King in Liverpool. Following my mother's death in 2015, I foolishly thought that the remaining murals were safe. In late 2016, I learned from Steve Haynes, a former parishioner, that the Oldham mural was under threat. Last August, we applied to Historic England to have it listed, having demonstrated that the overpainted fresco could be restored, and we've been campaigning for the mural to be preserved with incredible support from SAVE and a host of others. There's been coverage in the local, regional and national press, and even in the Hungarian national press. So that's really all I have to say before I hand over to Gordon. I need to unshare, don't I? No, I don't.
Where's Gordon? Having instructed you all very fiercely to mute yourselves, I suspect Gordon's now having to unmute himself. That's it. Brilliant.
At last, I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Could I have the first slide, please, Nick? Hello, Nick. Can you hear me? Nick, you're muted. Yes. Right. On the left-hand side is a photograph of Liverpool College of Art, as George would have known it in the 1950s when he was appointed to the college. And on the right-hand side is George in front of one of his mosaics, dressed in his characteristic white lab coat, which he always wore over his immaculate suit when he was in the studio. 60 very long years ago, I was a student in the mural department created by George Mayer-Marton, and later I worked with him as his assistant on the Pentecost Mural in the new parish church of the Holy Ghost in Netherton near Liverpool, and then later on his St. Clair's mural in Blakely in Manchester. The College of Art was highly regarded both regionally and nationally, and it was the first art college outside London in 1883 to have a purpose-built building. It was led in the 50s by an ambitious and able principal, William Stevenson. It's not at all surprising that George Mayer-Marton was appointed by Stevenson. He must have jumped at the opportunity to appoint someone with such an impressive background. Mayer-Marton was an accomplished painter, musician, historian, and poet, was an expert on Byzantine mosaic. He had exhibited widely throughout Europe between the wars, known leading European artists personally, became the vice president of the influential Hagenbund, group of artists in Vienna, and was already known in pre-war England, having in 1927 illustrated the poems of the young German poet Krabund, which were subsequently published by Heiden. He had painted murals and designed graphics, and was recently employed by SEMA, as Nick has just mentioned, the precursor of the Arts Council. Students were generally aware of George Mayer-Marton's suffering at the hands of the Nazis. However, this was something he never burdened others with. The only time that I knew him, that he touched obliquely on the matter, was when he once compared himself with the fictitious aristocrat, soldier, and adventurer, the Baron von Münchhausen, who had the wonderful ability to defy gravity and the laws of nature, escaping threats by lifting himself free by pulling on his own bootstraps. And this was a talent which George excelled. In the 5 years George Mayer-Marton spent at the Liverpool College of Art, his achievements were remarkable. He delivered challenging weekly seminars to students on the history of art and ideas, covering a vast range of topics, art, science, and philosophy, set up a new department of mural painting, the first in the country, gave weekly violin recitals to students, and also taught at Liverpool University. He produced and exhibited a prodigious number of oil paintings and watercolors, and created several large, impressive, innovative murals throughout the region. He set a demanding example that dedication and hard work was the only means of success. And his mosaics and frescoes commissioned by the Catholic Church stand as a great legacy. I quote his niece, Joanna Braithwaite, who, when in 1990, she wrote of his life and work and referred to the installation of the recently restored Pentecost Mosaic restored by Robin Riley and relocated in Liverpool's Catholic Cathedral. She said, when the Mosaic Pentecost was formally installed in the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool on May the 13th, 1989, there must have been those who asked, what strange chance had brought this about, that an agnostic Hungarian artist, proscribed by Hitler's Nuremberg laws, had carried out an exacting work based on a Byzantine tradition of mosaic learned in Ravenna between the wars. It's important to remember that Liverpool at the time was still a city of competing religious beliefs. In the immediate vicinity of the college was much evidence of this. Situated on the appropriately named Hope Street, at each end there was one uncompleted cathedral, an Anglican one and a Catholic one. 100 yards away was the early 20th century Neo-Byzantine church of St. Philip Neri, adorned by some appropriate coincidence with mosaics, and where an ex-college student was occupied painting Stations of the Cross. Next door to the church, the parish priest, Dr. John Garvin, was building an elaborate Spanish garden on a derelict bomb site as a mark of peace and reconciliation. In the absence of a Catholic cathedral, the Church of St. Philip Neri played an enhanced role within the church at the time. John Garvin was on friendly terms with the college and was a leading light in funding and fundraising for the new Catholic cathedral to be built upon the original Lutyens foundations. Post-war, there was a growth of church and school building in Britain, particularly in Liverpool, on account of the substantial immigrant Irish population. This led to a number of new Catholic parish churches and schools being built. The church's need for these to be adorned with religious imagery created an important opportunity for George Mayer-Marton. And it seems reasonable to suggest that Father Garvin and others of the clergy, particularly Sister Anthony, being familiar and in touch with the College of Art, made overtures to furnish these new churches with modern mosaics, just as the Church of St. Philip Neri had been similarly decorated in 1914. And being aware of George Mayer-Marton's expertise in this field, he must have been the obvious choice. Liverpool 8, though no provincial backwater, may have been a very modest substitute for the intellectual life of pre-war Vienna. But it did offer George Mayer-Marton security, talented and sympathetic and appreciative colleagues, and the possibility during the last 5 years of his life to create some of his most impressive work. Could I have the next slide, please, Nick? On the left-hand side is a replica that I made while a student of 2 of the soldiers' heads in the retinue of the Emperor Justinian in San Vitale from around about 1530. And on the right, we see George Mayer-Marton's The Violinist of the late 50s, and now in the Victoria Gallery collection in the University of Liverpool. Although Byzantine mosaics were derived from earlier flat Roman ones, mainly designed for floors, they were radically different in conception. Their surface was deliberately articulated, glass tessera of gold and bright colors being inserted into mortar at a variety of angles and depths to reflect light in a multiplicity of directions to produce ever-changing effects. And I photographed the replica from San Vitale in a low raking light to suggest how it might have appeared to people in the church in the mid-6th century. The relationship between George Mayer-Marton's easel paintings of the 50s and Byzantine mosaic is, I think, a very close one. And it appears to relate back to his visit to Ravenna before the war. Mosaics such as those in San Vitale were not so much works of art in their own right as political and religious statements of power. In the case of San Vitale, an evocation of the earthly authority of the Emperor Justinian as the guardian of divine authority. And in order to convey such unequivocal authority, they're dependent upon a heightened sense of presence and reality. The use of mosaic with its rich gold and brightly colored and reflective surfaces was the ideal medium to achieve this. In constantly changing light, it was possible to give this the impression that the boundary between simple portrayal of reality and actual reality had been crossed. The observer could never be sure. Eyes seem to follow you and figures come to life. I mean, it seems reasonable to claim that this suspension of disbelief was similar to our experience, perhaps, of cinema, where we have no problem in believing that the moving images on the silver screen are truly real events. In George Mayer-Marton's paintings of performing musicians, such as the violinist that we see here, he set himself the problem of how to convey on a flat picture frame, bounded by finite edges, the essence of a dynamically changing musical performance. The influences upon him were multiple. Italian futurism, Cubism probably suggested the idea of how to deal with movement and time, and the seminars he delivered then reveal his preoccupation with the ideas of synesthesia and the space-time continuum theories of Einstein. These influences were combined with stylistic elements of Byzantine mosaics and a palette closely reminiscent of Byzantine work. He developed an underlying tessellated structure that seemed derived directly from mosaics, that dissolved and enveloped the pictorial subject matter. In a similar way to that of mosaic, the surface of painting seems restless and in constant movement. And we're forced to engage in searching and tracing the many changing movements of the player. It becomes, I think, not so much a painting that might be titled The Violinist as one that might be titled The Performance of the violinist. The outcome is a simulation of the performance rather than a depiction of a single instant of it. Physical space and the concept of passing time is introduced, and we experience the thrust of the bow. We directly experience the urgency and excitement of the actual performance, and we even begin to believe that we can hear the music. Could we have the next slide, please, Nick? We see here on the left the Church of the Holy Ghost in Netherton, and on the scaffolding on the right-hand side is George Mayer-Marton, and on the left is myself. And on the right-hand side, we have the Pentecost Mosaic as it was installed in the Roman Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral. Creating a large mural is a pretty major undertaking, but creating one using mosaic adds to these challenges. The ever-present demon is that of time. Lime mortar sets quickly, and past a certain point, it will not securely hold tessera. Only very small sections can be completed before this occurs. Speed, skill, practice, and certainty are essential, and revisions are almost impossible. This demands something that's almost akin to an athletic discipline. And I often thought that George Mayer-Marton's experience as an Olympic swimmer and as a violinist made him eminently suited to producing mosaics. They all require similar preparation, practice, concentration, and stamina. Producing a mosaic such as the Pentecost becomes close to performance art. It's a highly physical, gestural, and in the end, theatrical business. The Pentecost Mural expresses this strong sense of immediacy, both in terms of its handling and its composition. And while George Mayer-Marton gave no indication of professing any religious faith, his innate sense of empathy meant that he was able to sympathetically understand the faith of others. And he had a great respect for the skills of workmen and the contribution they made. And these characteristics are echoed in the Pentecost Mosaic. What we see in the mosaic are real, humble, ordinary men, leaning in a group, reaching in amazement, and as promised, receiving the tongues of flame that will enable them to spread the gospel. As a violent wind blows from heaven, we can almost feel it, and we can hear it roar. I will end with what Hugh Scrutton, the then director of the Walker Art Gallery, aptly said concerning George Mayer-Marton in 1989 at the consecration of the Pentecost Mosaic, when it was moved to the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King. As Hugh Scrutton said, he was a highly civilized man and an artist of consistent accomplishment, whom our wretched century subjected to a generation of misfortunes, and yet who subdued them all. Thank you very much.
I'm going to hand over now to Professor Clare A.P.Willsdon, and I will mute myself.
Thank you. Well, I really did find that fascinating. Both of your talks I thoroughly enjoyed. I will try to follow them with a closer look at two murals, the two murals that survive in situ. And I'll share my screen with you so that you can see these. There we go. The Crucifixion in Oldham, the one that's under threat, and the Coronation of St. Clare in Baquis. And I'm showing you these really because they're part of the creation of new modernist style church buildings in the 1950s. We've heard how the church began to commission decoration for these new churches that it was putting up in the northwest of England. And the Oldham Crucifixion that you see on the left is believed to be the only mural by Mayer-Marton still in existence, whether in Britain or abroad, that uses both mosaic and painting in the one image. So we have the mosaic center part, the crucifix and the mandorla behind it, the gilded mosaic halos, and then this painted background and painted figures either side. This is a highly evocative combination, as we'll see, that as much as the crucifixion subject itself is the message. As a way into this pair of pictures, however, I'd like to take you back to that poignant moment when George Mayer-Marton and his wife Greta fled Vienna for London in 1938 that Nick mentioned. On their day of departure, the 27th of September, Mayer-Marton noted in his diary how they looked forward to freedom. For in Vienna under Hitler, he noted, we had become too accustomed to thinking each thought just half through, to leaving words unspoken, and to stifling our gestures. Well, here is the artist speaking, someone for whom the visual, the gesture, and not just the verbal is communication. Gesture reveals the workings of the mind, but he's had to get used to stifling it under the Nazi regime. What an irony of fate, then, that the two gesturing figures either side of the crucified Christ in his Oldham mural, the one with her hands clasped in grief, here we have her here, the other with his hand raised in shock or fear perhaps, should in the 1980s themselves be stifled, obliterated with white paint, as you see here in the church today. And together with the mysterious sky behind the cross, which seems to darken as Christ dies, as if nature too were gesturing, that has gone from sight as well. So we know these figures and the sky only from period photos of the mural like this one here. Just to go back for a minute, that's the church itself from the outside. You can see how the mural occupies the east end and there's a service in progress. This is the setup of St. Clare's in Baquis with the mosaic and the outside of the church. So these are kind of modernist buildings with these murals inside. It's very interesting, really, the motif that's being represented here, because we can work out that this figure, which is probably obliterated by all little pictures of ourselves, sorry about that, but the figure at the right, the one here, is holding a book. So he must be St. John, the disciple beloved of Jesus, as the Bible calls him. And St. John's Gospel tells how, as death approached, Christ told that beloved disciple, "Here is your mother," charging him, in other words, to look after Mary as if he was her own son. And he told Mary then, "Here is your son, John," his substitute, Christ's substitute henceforth. So it's that kind of moment, that one person being charged with looking after the other, that is in action here. In this context of Christ's instruction to those he loved to care for each other, those pained but ambiguous gestures of Mary and John might be read, I think, as having an additional transcendent meaning. Mary's grieving hands and the little tightly clasped fingers, palm to palm, also suggest perhaps praying ones. And John's raised hand, see it there, is also perhaps a hand held up in blessing. There's also perhaps a flickering of light in the ambivalent sky amidst the darkness. And I'd like to suggest that this is really an intensely powerful mural, even in its current truncated state. The monumental figure of Christ on the cross, silhouetted against a golden mandorla, dominates that east wall, and he's a sobering but also intensely dignified figure. This isn't a broken body like the Grunewald altarpiece that is in Colmar. Although Christ's head is bowed, the body itself is straight, the legs are straight, in the pose that we call Christus triumphans, the triumphant Christ. Although the head may belong to the Christus patiens, the suffering Christ tradition, see with its leaning angle, the body is straight. I'm grateful to my colleague, Dr. John Richards, for sorting out my thinking on that. Anyway, Mayer-Marton has in fact intriguingly combined here two seemingly opposite traditions of depiction of the crucified Christ. And Christ's straight body indeed appears all the stronger by contrast with the sinuous, swaying, vulnerable forms of Mary and John with fluttering drapery like that in a medieval manuscript illustration. This isn't, as I say, the emaciated, broken body of something like Matthias Grunewald's Isenheim altar or Isenheim altar Christ. The light from the windows to left and right above the mural, you can just make out the windows that let in light from above and from the sides. That light catches the gold of the mandorla and of Christ's halo and bounces off the different faces of the tesserae of the Byzantine type mosaic that Gordon has just described so wonderfully for us. So for all its monumentality, this figure of Christ seems almost to radiate light down onto the altar beneath and down again along the central aisle of the church to meet the light that is shining then up towards the mural from the stained glass that you find at the west end of the building. And that glass shows Mary with the infant Christ child. So the beginning meets the end meets the beginning. The mural plays an intensely symbolic role within the church interior, simply in the way it's conceived and placed within its architectural setting. Indeed, if we think of the light bouncing from the windows onto the mosaic and off it onto the consecrated bread and wine on the altar at communion, the bread and wine that Christian believers regard as the body and blood of Christ, then the symbolism of Mayer-Marton's imagery within the church building is even more dynamic. And surely personal, though Mayer-Marton wasn't a religious believer himself, as we've just heard, there is a squared up sketch for the Oldham mural that's recently come to light. And that shows that he originally drew two figures at the left. Here we are, a little detail of them here. Presumably Mary, the mother of Christ, and Mary Magdalene, whom the Bible mentions as also present at Christ's death. But by including only one in the mural as actually, carried out, plus St. John himself, he homes in on that moment that I've described where Christ is giving his mother and St. John to each other, that moment of care of one human for another, of provision, therefore, for the future. A moment that must, of course, have resonated with Mayer-Marton himself as an exile who, with his wife Greta, had been so reliant on others when he first arrived in Britain, yet who was now enriching his new home country through his art. So I think there is perhaps a personal element. I think it takes us back to that word empathy that Gordon so perceptively used, where he could empathize with how other religious people, how other people thought and used their religion. Well, this mural then was the first of Mayer-Marton's church schemes in the 1950s, alongside murals for several Roman Catholic schools in the Northwest and a secular scheme for the offices of Coastline in Liverpool. We don't exactly know how he got these commissions. Gordon has suggested a very plausible route, I think, but the fact that he'd set up a course in mural art at Liverpool's School of Art could, I think, have brought him into contact with Liverpool's very progressive School of Architecture that had embraced modernist approaches. So that may be another factor at work as well. Anyway, in Oldham, despite this modernist architectural context, we find two ancient techniques, the Byzantine faceted mosaic that he's reviving for Christ on the cross and the halos, and fresco for this painted part either side for Mary, John, and the sky behind. Fresco, of course, is used in medieval churches and again in the Italian Renaissance for many religious and secular works, and both fresco and mosaic involve working in wet plaster. In fresco, the pigment bonds with the plaster as it dries, just as in mosaic, the tesserae are embedded into it whilst it's still soft. In other words, the very techniques in play here fuse the image with the building for what is meant to be a permanent alliance. In Austria, where Mayer-Marton had been vice president of the progressive Hagenbund Art Society, as we've heard, before he came to Britain, there had been much interest in the symbolic potential of fresco as part of a wider revival of fresco technique that we also see in a number of other European countries in the interwar period, in Sweden at Stockholm City Hall, for example, in France with the Breton artists and so on. And there's an interesting article of 1926 by the Austrian artist Anton Feistauer, whom the Hagenbund welcomed as a guest exhibitor, in which he discusses the Raumverbundenheit, the connection with the room or with the interior space of fresco. Feistauer argues that because it's bonded with the very fabric of the building where it's painted, the pigment fusing with the wet plaster, a fresco represents the, quote, being and living of those with whom that building is associated. And by that logic, I think we might see a fresco in a church as actually embodying God or Christ. It's not just a depiction, but something more subtle, even physical, not least because it's intended to last. Feistauer also writes of fresco being a mirror, as he calls it, to those who use the room. And in a church context, of course, we can perhaps understand that as the mural connecting with, even reaching out to the congregation and bringing its spiritual power into their everyday lives. So all this makes the Oldham mural, I think, very special. It looks back to the arts and crafts movement tradition of unity of art and architecture, inspired by medieval models that had been influential both in early 20th century Britain and in Vienna. But it also takes its place alongside the new modernist vision of the post-war era, the world of the 1951 Festival of Britain, for example. Many of the modernist style pavilions in the Festival of Britain had been decorated with murals, but they were, of course, impermanent structures destined to be dismantled after the festival. At Oldham, by contrast, Mayer-Marton was making something intended to be permanent with all the added symbolism of looking to a better future that would have been present in the wake of war and the Holocaust. As I mentioned then, the Oldham Crucifixion is the only surviving mural by Mayer-Marton to involve both fresco and mosaic, and that's another reason I think why it's so vital to try to conserve and preserve it, and in situ. Feasibility study has shown that it's perfectly possible for the white paint currently disfiguring it to be removed by professional conservators. Well, before I turn to Mayer-Marton's mosaic at St. Clare's, it's worth noting another intriguing feature of this Oldham mural, because there's a very interesting preparatory line drawing, here we are, showing that initially, or at some stage anyway, Mayer-Marton conceived the label, the INRI label above Christ's head that is traditionally shown in images of the crucifixion. It stands there to tell us this is the King of the Jews or the King of Israel. But in the mural, this disappears. We don't see it there. Perhaps it was too fraught an element for an artist of Jewish heritage, or, and I suspect this might be nearer the truth, given that Mayer-Marton was not apparently himself religious, it would have distracted the eye from the plain, almost severe geometry of the body of Christ on the cross that harmonizes with the simplified monolith forms of the building. And that, of course, speaks visually the power of the non-verbal, again, the language of gesture and of form. Gordon has recalled that Mayer-Marton discussed Salvatore Dali's St. John of the Cross in his classes at Liverpool's School of Art. So it's likely that Mayer-Marton would also have been aware of Dali's Crucifixion, called the Corpus Hypercubus, now in New York and completed in 1954, just as he would have been beginning the Oldham mural. You can find a reproduction of that work online, and you'll see that it too omits the INRI and it emphasizes the healthy, resurgent body of Christ set against a hypercube, a volumetric cross, which is part of Dali's complex perception of connections between the mathematical and the spiritual. Is it too fanciful to make a link in turn to Mayer-Marton's use of Byzantine mosaic with its volumetric reflective tesserae? Another name for a hypercube, after all, is our tessera. In the Viennese tradition of mural decoration in the early 20th century, we certainly find Mayer-Marton's colleague Anton Feischdauer, whom I quoted from a few minutes back, using the word cubing to describe how murals expand and deepen the surface of the wall with visual imagery that in turn projects itself out into the lives and being of the users of the room it decorates. We have another dimension, if you excuse the pun, of that totality of music and architecture, mural and architecture, image and location that I've been exploring in this remarkable work at Oldham, and one that I think simply further emphasizes the need for it to be conserved and kept in situ, in symbolic conjunction with the same architectural setting for which and in which it was made. Well, Mayer-Marton's fascinating mural of St. Clare at Blackley in Manchester is totally mosaic. There's no fresco in it. It was completed in 1958, a few years after his work at Oldham. And here too, Vienna is surely latent. The flower-dotted grass beneath St. Clare's feet, after all, calls to mind that in Klimt's famous Kiss painting, a vision of the secular love, perhaps of the kiss, translated into Clare's love for her community of nuns at Assisi, a religious version of love. And that's the city that we see in the background of the mural. You can maybe just make out the towers and the cypress trees and so on. So if Mayer-Marton also references here the coloured flowers and herbs that we read about in the Canticle of the Creatures that St. Francis wrote under Clare's care, then Manchester's own great Heaton Park is of course near to Blackley. Past and present, the real and the spiritual come together again. This mural is lovingly preserved in its original location. It's the focal point at the east end of another modernist building. You can see it there. It forms the backdrop to the altar opposite a small mosaic font, also by Mayer-Marton. And it shows St. Clare being crowned by Christ. So here's Christ, here's the crown, the Virgin's praying alongside, and Clare herself is holding up the shining monstrance with which she defended her convent near Assisi from Saracen invasion in medieval times. This iconography clearly illustrates the letter that St. Clare wrote to St. Agnes of Prague, explaining how loving Christ would enable her to be purified. A golden crown, in quotes, would be placed on her head by Christ as a sign of her holiness. Gesture, again, that visual language. Whilst Clare's gesture of display of the monstrance is very much the focal motif then in the mural, there's an intriguing twist to it. Mayer-Marton seems to shift her gaze subtly upwards. It's as though caught in the light of her monstrance, her burning eyes seem fixed, almost as if she's hallucinating on some inner vision. In this sense, we might perhaps read the coronation, whether it's of herself, St. Agnes, or the Virgin even, as that vision mediated by her to us. And again, I'm very grateful to my colleague, Dr. John Richards, for discussing this with me and opening up the idea of the vision. As she stands triumphantly, and you can make it out here, on the curving sword of one of the Saracens invading, whom she'd managed to deflect and managed to see off, as it were, so that they didn't overcome her convent. As she stands triumphantly on that curving sword, we see blades of green grass. You can just see them poking up here, life in place of death, thrusting up from the flowered ground with its daisies and buttercups. Daisies, of course, are day's eyes, emblems of renewal. Light from the Holy Spirit above, meanwhile, descends on the coronation scene, and white light flickers around Clare, arcing near her feet, as if to earth the sword's deathly power. This sort of almost an effect almost of electric sparks or light, perhaps only fitting, in fact, given Manchester's proud place in electrical history as the home of pioneers such as John Dalton and Sebastian de Ferranti. And once again, the technique is part of the message. The faceted tesserae of the Byzantine mosaic bounce light from the nearby windows to the altar below, the focus of Eucharistic liturgy. And had Mayer-Marton's designs for exterior mosaics of the Virgin and Saints at St. Clare's been completed as he planned, the play of inner and outer, light and dark, would have been richer still. So if this mural betrays Mayer-Marton's Viennese origins, Clare's inward gaze perhaps suggesting the exploration by Freud of the psyche, just as the flowered ground recalls Klimt, it's also clearly a most sensitive response to Roman Catholic belief, that idea of empathy coming in again. And to Blackley itself, likewise, as the place in which the mural is found, because Blackley means a clearing in dark woods, light within dark again. The mural is even perhaps a homage to Mayer-Marton's beloved sister, given that she was called Clare. Well then, we've heard from Nick and Gordon about the Pentecost mural, now in Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, and together with the Crucifixion at Oldham and the mural we've just been looking at Blackley, I think we have three works that are, as it were, treasures of the Northwest and that document a unique and exciting phase in British mural decoration, in which the Gothic revival tradition, so central to much ecclesiastical decoration in Britain in the 19th and earlier 20th century, was given a new expressive slant as part of modernist architecture. Mayer-Marton's murals, I think, deserve to be recognised as one of the great highlights of the émigré tradition in Britain. And I do sincerely hope that the full glory of the Crucifixion mural can soon be secured again through careful conservation and sympathetic preservation in situ. So thank you. I hope that's given a little introduction to these really very, very fascinating mosaics and mural mosaic. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Claire, and indeed Gordon and Nick. I'm sure everybody will agree that the three talks together complemented each other magnificently well and was totally fascinating. So yes, indeed, very, very hearty clap. I think it's quite late. I haven't had any questions coming in. Rather surprisingly, there is much that could be said. Now is your chance. If anybody wishes to ask anything, please do so now. No? It's the problem about starting at 8 o'clock and the night is drawing on, as they say. Lots of things I would like to say, and I wonder if I could just ask one or two questions. I suspect you won't know the answers, but perhaps addressed to you, Nick, in the first instance. I noticed the address of Elm Tree Road in St John's Wood, and indeed a mention of the St John's Wood Art School. Who was that actually run by? And one reason I'm intrigued by the Elm Tree Road address is that I actually had the pleasure of meeting when he was a very, very old man, way back in the 1980s, I guess, somebody called Otto Flatter, who lived in that same road, who was another emigre artist. And I just wondered if you had any evidence at all of paths crossing there.
That's a sort of nightmare question.
Yeah, it's a shot in the dark, but
absolutely no idea, I'm afraid.
No. Does anybody, I wonder if anybody in the assembled company has any comments there? And the other connection I was curious about is that, you know, mosaic is obviously a very niche area. And first of all, I'm very struck how extraordinary it is that, as far as we know, am I right, that he hadn't worked in mosaic in Vienna? Am I right? Or is it something he came to afresh, as it were?
As far as we can tell, he hadn't worked in mosaic. Yeah. I might be wrong about that.
I mean, that's interesting and rather extraordinary in itself, but there's another emigre mosaic artist who I actually remember from my childhood going to visit his studio and being fascinated by all the tesserae, called Hans Unger, who's of, I think, possibly German or possibly Austrian, I'd have to double check. But again, one of the few, you know, really expert practitioners of the medium. And I just wondered again if there was any evidence of connections there. No.
I'm not aware. I mean,
no, I mean, I think there's still a lot, isn't there? A lot. And Claire, you ended with that tantalizing statement about the emigre contribution, and I would love to pick you up on that, but I think for lack of time, we won't. Hold on, one question, I do believe. Let's see. Oh, yes, a question about his sister Clary. Did George's sister get out before the war? Did she work in Britain?
Yes, she was actually a textile designer, and she and my grandfather came out 6 months after George in 1938. I think George was there, and probably Greta too, was their reception committee at Victoria Station. And well, it's another story which I probably shouldn't go into, but he and Clary were extremely close. And she lived a long life, actually. Yeah.
Interesting. Did your mother ever talk about to what extent George talked about the profound losses he experienced?
I think he was fairly typical of his generation in just sort of putting the lid of a pressure cooker on top of it. I think she was just very aware of it because she used to go to tea with him once a week in his room in Belsize Park, and they talked about a lot of things. And she regarded him as a kind of father figure. Mm. So I can't tell you exactly how much he talked about it. There was one story that she did tell about Greta, who was in a mental asylum in Cornwall. George was teaching at the Tate, and my mother was on a school visit to the Tate. And my mother saw George there, and he was white as a sheet, because Greta had walked all the way from Cornwall pushing a pram. She'd escaped from the asylum. So I think she said his face was twitching. So that's all I know about that story.
Some much more mundane questions coming in, but I think still worth asking. Somebody, actually a comment rather than a question, from Adrian Bailey. Hungary was in the early 20th century very advanced in electrical power, not just Manchester. And from Andy C, where did George undertake his Welsh landscapes? Where in fact was he working? Do we know?
He was traveling all over the place for SEMA, giving lectures all around the country. So two places that spring to mind are Llantonni, Aberglaslyn. In fact, there are two of the oil paintings that I showed were from Llantonni. But he traveled all over the north of England, Scotland, Yorkshire. There are watercolors from practically everywhere, and a lot of oils as well.
And somebody here, Anthony N, can't resist pointing out that it's Blakely, not Blackley. Sorry, but I'm a native of those parts. So for future reference. And a question here from Chris Cotton. Is Gordon, this is a question for you, Gordon, wherever you're lurking, there you are. Is Gordon able to offer any thoughts on the point at which George was appointed in the development of the building project? Was George collaborating with the architect or commissioned once the building was constructed?
It's hard to say because as students, I suppose we didn't feel it was up to us to discuss those things. I mean, in those days, relationships were really rather different. And we didn't feel we wanted to intrude in things like that. So we weren't really part. And even when I was working with him as his assistant, you know, I felt that one couldn't really pursue that. So it's hard to say definitively. I would have thought that his understanding of architecture was such that he would have wanted to discuss with the architect. And then further to that, he always insisted that a mural should not be a picture on a wall, but it should be something that was integral to the architectonic character of the building. And I couldn't conceive that he would have let that idea go.
Indeed. And an important question from Agnes Corey, herself, I believe, is Hungarian origin. To what extent is George appreciated in Austria, in Hungary these days?
I'm not sure I can answer that very well. we've actually had a lot of interest from the Hungarian community in this recent campaign. And there was, as I think I mentioned, there was even an article in the Hungarian national press very recently about him. So I think, my understanding, he's regarded as a very important Hungarian artist, and I think I understand that's the view of the director of the Hungarian National Gallery.
And we have various members or people associated with the Hungarian Cultural Centre listening in today, I notice with pleasure. Very good. I think it's probably time to round things off. Let me just check. Is there one last question? Yes, from Mate, from the Hungarian Cultural Centre. I believe the campaign helps the Hungarians rediscover Mayer-Marton's work. That's undoubtedly true. And from Hugh William Mann, thank you so much for the lecture. It's enlightened me so much. Well, here. Very good. So let me just round things off by saying that the event has been recorded. So for those of you who'd like to listen again, there was much to sort of mull over and digest, or would like to tell friends and family about it. It will be uploaded in a week or so, within the week, on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. And also to alert you to an event that may well be of interest to those of you here tonight. And that is a one-day conference. It remains to be decided whether it's going to be entirely online or partly live, but being held at the erstwhile Festival of Britain Church, just apropos one comment that was made, St. John's Waterloo, where they have two magnificent Hans Feibusch mural paintings, and questions for another day, but it's going to be on this broader topic that we've kind of been skirting around in tantalizing sorts of ways. In other words, the really rather large and perhaps surprisingly large number of artists of, well, at least technically Jewish background, often not, certainly not Orthodox or not even practicing Jews, but of Jewish origin, shall we say, who found sanctuary in this country, who ended up being either preoccupied with Christian iconography in their work and or working for the Christian church in the UK. And it's a fascinating topic, which particularly intrigues me. And that's happening on the 16th of June. And if you're interested in finding out more, I don't think the bookings have been sort of released yet, but it will be very, very soon. It's on the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website. If you go to the What's On section there and sort of scroll down, 16th of June. So I would urge you to investigate that and sign up if you're interested. So I think it probably remains only for me to say thank you to everyone. Yes, many thanks from all quarters, Shulamit, Isabel Braithwaite, who I suspect you know, Nick, and Susan Perkins likewise. Lovely. Well, what a rewarding event. Thank you ever so much, everyone, for being here. And I hope to see you again at other events. And very good luck with the campaign, Nick. You're doing a wonderful job. And I cannot believe, I mean, it's such a powerful work, isn't it? How could it possibly not succeed? And as for the book, Robert, I think Robert Waterhouse, who's the man behind the Safe Haven book and the so-called Baquis Little Books, of which the Mayer-Marton book is one. Robert, do you want to just say a few quick words about the best way to get hold of the book? Go ahead, have the last say.
Well, at the previous session, it transpires there's a certain resistance to buying on Amazon amongst people. I don't have the problem because I live in the south of France, and it's the way of getting books from rare books and all the rest. But I would suggest the best thing to do is to order from your local bookseller. I have friends who've already ordered books and received them, so it's possible. The books have been published, they have been launched, even though the date is March 28th, I think, officially. Apart from that, you can also buy them via Save, because Save have the campaign, which is obviously behind what we've all been talking about this evening. They have books to sell, which you can buy from them at £5, I think. And that would that way you avoid Amazon, and you even avoid your local bookseller. Anyway, thank you very much for your interest.
And you're supporting the campaign in the process. Yes, I think that's probably the best route, isn't it?
Thanks, Robert, so much.
There's also apparently a website called bookdepository.com, which is an alternative to the dreaded Amazon. Very good. No, it's a lovely book. It really is, as I say, small and exquisitely produced. Packs a punch. Lovely. So thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
And 2 others, by the way.
And there are others, yes, indeed, it's part of a series. Check it out, Baquis Books, Baquis. Okay, all the best. Good night to everyone. Keep
Thank you
well.
very much. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.